Jinwoo stuck in a dungeon where time stands still. Part 1. The world of hunters was one of chaos and order, a delicate balance between the mundane and the extraordinary. Gates, mysterious portals to dungeons filled with monsters and treasures, had appeared decades ago, reshaping society and birthing a new class of warriors known as hunters. These individuals, blessed with supernatural abilities, ventured into the dungeons to protect humanity and claim the riches within. Among them was Jinwoo, a young hunter whose name was whispered with both admiration and pity. He was known for his unyielding determination, but also for his cursed luck, a string of failed missions and near-death experiences that had earned him the nickname the Unlucky Hunter. Yet, Jinwoo never gave up. His motivation was simple: to provide for his ailing mother and younger sister, who relied on him entirely. The story began on a crisp autumn morning, the sky painted in hues of orange and gold as Jinwoo stood before a newly discovered gate. Unlike the usual shimmering portals, this one was eerily still, its surface a mirror-like void that seemed to swallow the light around it. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and the faint hum of energy emanating from the gate sent a shiver down Jinwoo's spine. He adjusted the straps of his worn leather armor, his fingers brushing against the hilt of his dagger, a weapon as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Beside him stood his team, a ragtag group of hunters who, like him, had been assigned to this low-ranking mission. There was Minji, a sharp-eyed archer with a knack for precision, Daeho, a burly tank whose shield could withstand even the fiercest blows, and Su-young, a healer whose gentle demeanor belied her fierce loyalty. Together, they were a mismatched but dependable team, bound by their shared struggles and dreams of a better life. As they stepped through the gate, the world around them shifted in an instant. The dungeon was unlike anything they had ever seen. The air was heavy and stagnant, as if time itself had been frozen. The walls of the cavernous chamber were lined with jagged crystals that glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and cold, like polished obsidian, and the silence was deafening. Jinwoo's instinct screamed at him to be cautious, but he pushed the unease aside, focusing on the task at hand. The mission was straightforward: clear the dungeon of monsters and retrieve any valuable artifacts. Yet, as they ventured deeper, the oppressive atmosphere grew more suffocating, and the faint hum of the gate seemed to echo in their minds. It wasn't long before they encountered their first opponent, a hulking creature with skin like molten rock and eyes that burned with an unnatural fire. The monster roared, its voice shaking the very air, and charged at them with terrifying speed. Jinwoo reacted instantly, his body moving on instinct as he darted forward, his dagger flashing in the dim light. He aimed for the creature's weak spot, a glowing fissure in its chest, but the monster was faster than it looked. It swung its massive arm, forcing Jinwoo to leap back, his heart pounding in his chest. Minji loosed an arrow, the projectile striking the monster's shoulder and causing it to stagger. Daeho stepped in, his shield raised as he absorbed the brunt of the creature's next attack, the impact sending shockwaves through the ground. Su-young chanted softly, her hands glowing with a soft light as she healed the minor injuries sustained by her teammates. The battle was intense, each member of the team relying on their unique skills to keep the monster at bay. Jinwoo's agility and precision allowed him to land quick, calculated strikes, while Minji's arrows kept the creature distracted. Daeho's defensive prowess provided a much-needed buffer, and Su-young's healing ensured they could endure the prolonged fight. Yet, despite their efforts, the monster seemed almost invincible, its strength and resilience far beyond what they had anticipated. Just as the situation seemed dire, Jinwoo noticed something, a faint pulse of energy emanating from the crystals on the walls. Without hesitation, he shouted for his team to focus their attacks on the crystals. As the shards shattered, the monster let out a deafening roar, its body beginning to crack and crumble. With one final, coordinated strike, they brought the creature down, its form disintegrating into ash. As the dust settled, Jinwoo couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The dungeon was too quiet, too still, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on his mind. He glanced at his teammates, their faces pale and drawn, and knew they felt it too. They pressed on, driven by a mix of determination and unease, but the deeper they went, the more the dungeon seemed to resist them. The walls shifted and twisted, the crystals pulsed with a malevolent energy, and the air grew colder with each step. It was as if the dungeon itself was alive, watching them, testing them. By the time they reached the heart of the dungeon, they were exhausted, their bodies battered and their spirits worn. The chamber before them was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, and at its center stood a massive crystal, its surface swirling with dark energy. Jinwoo approached cautiously, his dagger at the ready, but before he could react, the crystal shattered, releasing a wave of energy that sent him and his team flying. As he struggled to his feet, he saw it, a figure emerging from the shards, its form humanoid but distorted, as if it were a shadow given life. The figure spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed in Jinwoo's mind. "You are not supposed to be here," it said, its words laced with malice. "This is a place where time stands still, and you are but intruders in a realm beyond your understanding." Jinwoo's heart raced as he realized the gravity of their situation. This was no ordinary dungeon, and the figure before them was no ordinary foe. The initial conflict had only been a test, a prelude to the true threat that awaited them. As the shadowy figure advanced, Jinwoo tightened his grip on his dagger, his mind racing with strategies and possibilities. He knew they were outmatched, but he also knew they had no choice but to fight. For his family, for his team, and for his own survival, Jinwoo would face this enemy head-on, even if it meant risking everything. The battle that followed was a blur of motion and chaos, each strike and counterstrike pushing Jinwoo and his team to their limits. But even as they fought, a single thought lingered in Jinwoo's mind: this was only the beginning, and the true danger was yet to come. Jinwoo's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood in the dimly lit chamber of the dungeon, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient magic. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across the walls, making the eerie carvings seem alive. He had been here for what felt like an eternity, though time itself had no meaning in this cursed place. The dungeon was a labyrinth of traps, monsters, and riddles, and Jinwoo had barely survived the first wave of challenges. His muscles ached, his mana reserves were dangerously low, and the weight of isolation pressed heavily on his mind. But now, as he pressed forward, he realized the dungeon wasn't done with him yet. The first sign of trouble came when the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Jinwoo froze, his instincts screaming at him to move, but the tremors were too sudden. The stone floor cracked open, and a swarm of skeletal warriors erupted from the depths, their hollow eye sockets glowing with a malevolent red light. Jinwoo cursed under his breath, summoning his daggers from his inventory. The blades shimmered with a faint blue aura as he activated his shadow step ability, vanishing from sight just as the first skeleton lunged at him. He reappeared behind the creature, driving his dagger into its spine. The skeleton crumbled to dust, but more were already closing in. As Jinwoo fought, he noticed something strange. The skeletons weren't just mindless minions, they moved with a coordinated precision, as if guided by an unseen intelligence. He narrowly dodged a spear thrust, rolling to the side and slashing at the attacker's legs. The skeleton fell, but another took its place, forcing Jinwoo to retreat. He was outnumbered, and his stamina was dwindling. Just as he considered using his last mana potion, a voice echoed through the chamber. "Need a hand, Jinwoo?" He turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a woman clad in leather armor, her twin swords gleaming in the torchlight. It was Lena, a fellow adventurer he had met briefly in the dungeon's earlier levels. Her presence was both a relief and a cause for suspicion. How had she found him? And why now? Jinwoo didn't have time to dwell on it as Lena charged into the fray, her blades a blur of motion as she cut through the skeletons with practiced ease. "Took you long enough," Jinwoo muttered, sidestepping a sword strike and countering with a precise slash to the skeleton's neck. "You're welcome," Lena shot back, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Now, let's finish this before more show up." The two fought side by side, their movements synchronized despite their lack of prior teamwork. Jinwoo's shadow step allowed him to dart in and out of combat, while Lena's dual-wielding style kept the skeletons at bay. They cleared the chamber, but the victory was short-lived. As the last skeleton fell, the ground shook again, and a deafening roar echoed through the dungeon. A massive, hulking figure emerged from the shadows, a towering golem made of jagged stone, its eyes glowing with the same red light as the skeletons. "Great," Lena said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just what we needed." Jinwoo gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The golem was too large to take head-on, and its stone body would be nearly impervious to their weapons. He glanced around the chamber, searching for anything they could use to their advantage. His eyes landed on the crumbling pillars that lined the room. If they could bring one down on the golem, it might buy them enough time to escape, or even defeat it. "Lena, distract it," Jinwoo shouted, already moving toward the nearest pillar. "Distract it? Are you insane?" She yelled back, but she didn't hesitate. Lena darted forward, her swords flashing as she slashed at the golem's legs. The creature roared in anger, swinging its massive fists at her. She dodged with agility, but one glancing blow sent her sprawling. Jinwoo winced but focused on his task. He climbed onto a nearby ledge, using his daggers to chip away at the pillar's base. The stone was brittle, and it didn't take long for cracks to form. "Lena, get clear," he shouted, leaping off the ledge just as the pillar began to collapse. The golem turned, its glowing eyes locking onto Jinwoo, but it was too late. The pillar crashed down, burying the creature under a pile of rubble. Jinwoo landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He struggled to his feet, his body protesting every movement. Lena appeared at his side, her expression a mix of relief and annoyance. "You could have warned me sooner," she said, brushing dust off her armor. "You're welcome," Jinwoo replied, echoing her earlier words. He turned to survey the damage. The golem was still moving, its stone body cracked but not broken. It let out a guttural growl, pushing itself free of the rubble. Jinwoo's heart sank. They were running out of options. Before they could regroup, a new threat emerged. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a man in dark robes, his face obscured by a hood. He raised his hand, and the golem froze in place, its glowing eyes dimming. Jinwoo and Lena exchanged wary glances as the man spoke, his voice cold and calculating. "Impressive," he said, "but you're wasting your time. This dungeon is a prison, and you're merely pawns in a game you don't understand." Jinwoo's grip tightened on his daggers. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Jinwoo's spine. "Call me the Warden. And if you want to survive, you'll need to play by my rules." Lena stepped forward, her swords at the ready. "We're not playing anyone's game. Let us out of here." The Warden's smile was cruel. "Oh, but the game has only just begun. And trust me, you'll find it enlightening." With that, he vanished into the shadows, leaving Jinwoo and Lena alone with the looming threat of the golem and the growing sense of unease. Jinwoo's mind raced. The Warden's words hinted at a larger conspiracy, and the dungeon's endless challenges were starting to feel like a test, or a trap. Lena's presence was both a boon and a potential liability. Could he trust her? Or was she part of the Warden's game? As the golem stirred, Jinwoo made a decision. "We need to work together," he said, meeting Lena's gaze. "But keep your guard up. Something's not right here." Lena nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. Let's take this thing down and figure out what's really going on." The two prepared for the next wave of combat, their uneasy alliance forged in the face of an uncertain future. The dungeon's mysteries were deepening, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jinwoo knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Jinwoo stood at the edge of the dungeon's central chamber, his breath steady but his mind racing. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint metallic tang of blood. The group had been navigating the labyrinth for what felt like days, though time had no meaning in this cursed place. Shadows danced across the walls, cast by the flickering light of their torches, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the cavernous halls. They had just defeated a swarm of skeletal warriors, their bones now scattered across the floor, but the victory felt hollow. Something was off. The dungeon was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. That's when they heard it, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet, until it culminated in a deafening crack. A section of the wall split open, dust and debris raining down as a figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim light. The newcomer stepped forward, revealing a tall, lithe woman clad in a flowing black cloak adorned with silver runes. Her eyes glowed faintly, a piercing blue that seemed to cut through the darkness, and her presence was magnetic, commanding attention without a word. In her hand, she held a staff carved from what appeared to be bone, its tip crackling with faint arcs of energy. "Who are you?" Jinwoo demanded, his voice steady but edged with caution. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, though he didn't draw it, not yet. The woman tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Names are trivial in a place like this," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, yet carrying an undercurrent of danger. "But if you must call me something, you may refer to me as Celine. I've been watching you, Jinwoo. You and your little band of misfits." The group tensed at her words. Hana, the group's rogue, stepped forward, her daggers glinting in the torchlight. "Watching us? For how long? And why?" Celine's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Long enough to know you're out of your depth. This dungeon isn't just a prison for monsters, it's a trap, designed to ensnare those who dare to challenge it. And you, Jinwoo, are the key to its undoing. Or its destruction. The question is, which will it be?" Before Jinwoo could respond, Celine raised her staff, and the air around her shimmered. A wave of energy erupted from the tip, hurtling toward the group. Jinwoo reacted instantly, drawing his sword and slashing through the energy wave, dispersing it with a burst of sparks. The force of the impact sent him skidding backward, his boots scraping against the stone floor. "Stay back," he shouted to the others, his eyes locked on Celine. Hana didn't need to be told twice. She darted to the side, her movements fluid and silent, aiming to flank Celine. But the woman was faster. With a flick of her wrist, Celine summoned a barrier of swirling shadows that intercepted Hana mid-leap, sending her sprawling to the ground. "You're quick," Celine remarked, her tone almost amused. "But not quick enough." Jinwoo lunged forward, his sword arcing through the air in a precise strike aimed at Celine's midsection. She parried with her staff, the clash of metal against bone ringing out sharply. Jinwoo pressed the attack, his movements a blur of speed and precision, but Celine matched him blow for blow. Her staff moved like an extension of her body, deflecting his strikes with ease and countering with bursts of dark energy that forced him to retreat. Meanwhile, Kale, the group's mage, had been gathering his power. He raised his hands, chanting under his breath as glowing runes circled around him. With a final incantation, he unleashed a torrent of fire, the flames roaring towards Celine like a hungry beast. She turned her attention to him just as the fire reached her, but instead of dodging, she extended her hand. The flames split around her, funneling into a swirling vortex before being absorbed into her staff. "Impressive," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "But fire is such a mundane weapon. Allow me to show you true power." She thrust her staff into the ground, and the runes on her cloak flared to life. The ground beneath them cracked, and tendrils of shadow erupted, lashing out at the group. Jinwoo dodged one, slicing through another with his sword, but Hana wasn't as lucky. A tendril wrapped around her ankle, yanking her off her feet and slamming her into the ground. She cried out in pain, her dagger slipping from her grasp. "Hana!" Jinwoo shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He charged at Celine, his sword glowing with a faint blue light as he channeled his energy into it. Celine met his strike head-on, the force of their collision sending shockwaves through the chamber. For a moment, they were locked in a deadly stalemate, their weapons trembling under the strain. But then Celine's smile returned, and she whispered something under her breath. Jinwoo felt a surge of energy ripple through him, and suddenly his sword grew heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force. He stumbled, and Celine took advantage, delivering a swift kick to his chest that sent him flying backward. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of him. Kale tried to intervene, hurling a barrage of ice shards at Celine, but she deflected them with a wave of her hand. "Enough of this," she said, her tone growing colder. "You're all so predictable. It's almost disappointing." As Jinwoo struggled to his feet, he realized they were outmatched. Celine was unlike any foe they had faced before, her power was vast, her movements precise, and her motives unclear. But there was something else, something in the way she looked at him, as if she knew something he didn't. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice strained. "What do you want from us?" Celine's expression softened, just for a moment, and she lowered her staff. "I want what you want, Jinwoo," she said. "To escape this place. But unlike you, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Even if it means using you as a pawn." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jinwoo's mind raced, trying to piece together her meaning, but before he could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The walls of the chamber cracked, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the dungeon. Celine's eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely alarmed. "It's too late," she muttered. "It's awake." The group barely had time to react before the floor gave way, plunging them into darkness. As they fell, Jinwoo caught a glimpse of Celine's face, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than any of them, and it was clear that their fragile alliance, if it could even be called that, was about to be tested like never before. Jinwoo's breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the cold, unyielding stone wall of the dungeon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of blood. His sword, slick with the ichor of countless monsters, trembled in his grip. He had been fighting for what felt like an eternity, though time itself was meaningless in this cursed place. The dungeon's labyrinthine corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn revealing new horrors and challenges. But now, as he stood at the edge of a vast, cavernous chamber, he felt a shift in the air, a tension that prickled at his skin and set his nerves on edge. The chamber was unlike anything he had encountered before. Its walls shimmered with an otherworldly light, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters. At its center stood a massive, obsidian throne, upon which sat a figure cloaked in darkness. Jinwoo's heart pounded as he recognized the figure. It was the dungeon's master, the being he had been searching for since he first became trapped in this timeless hell. The figure's presence was overwhelming, radiating a power that made the air itself feel heavy. Jinwoo tightened his grip on his sword and stepped forward, his boots echoing against the stone floor. "So, you've finally made it this far," the figure said, its voice a low, resonant growl that seemed to reverberate through Jinwoo's very bones. "I must admit, I didn't expect you to survive this long. But then again, you've always been full of surprises, haven't you, Jinwoo? Jinwoo froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years, one he had thought lost to the annals of time. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, as the figure rose from the throne and stepped into the light, Jinwoo's worst fears were confirmed. The figure was none other than his older brother, Jinwoo. Jinwoo's sword slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground as he stared in disbelief. Jinwoo had disappeared years ago, presumed dead after a failed expedition into a high-level dungeon. Jinwoo had mourned him, had carried the weight of his loss every day since. And now, here he was, standing before him as the master of the very dungeon Jinwoo had been struggling to escape. Jinwoo? Jinwoo whispered, his voice trembling. How? How is this possible? Jinwoo's lips curled into a cold, mocking smile. Oh, Jinwoo. You always were so naive. Did you really think I was dead? Or did you just want to believe it, so you wouldn't have to face the truth? Jinwoo's mind reeled. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade, leaving him numb and disoriented. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. Jinwoo's eyes, once warm and kind, now glowed with a malevolent light, and his once familiar features were twisted into something unrecognizable. You see, Jinwoo, Jinwoo continued, his voice dripping with disdain, I didn't just survive that dungeon. I conquered it. I became its master. And now, I brought you here to join me. Together, we can rule this timeless realm, free from the constraints of the outside world. Isn't that what you've always wanted? To be free? Jinwoo shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. No. This isn't freedom. This is a prison. And I won't let you trap me here. Jinwoo's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. Then you leave me no choice. With a wave of his hand, Jinwoo summoned a horde of monstrous creatures, their eyes glowing with a feral hunger. They surged forward, their claws and fangs bared, and Jinwoo barely had time to retrieve his sword before they were upon him. The fight was brutal and chaotic, each swing of his blade a desperate bid for survival. The creatures were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, and Jinwoo knew he couldn't keep this up forever. As he fought, his mind raced, trying to find a way to turn the tide. He couldn't defeat Jinwoo in a direct confrontation, his brother's power was too great. But perhaps there was another way. Jinwoo's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. His gaze fell on the shimmering walls, and an idea began to take shape. The walls weren't just decorative, they were a source of the dungeon's power. If he could disrupt them, he might be able to weaken Jinwoo's hold on the dungeon. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance he had. With a roar, Jinwoo charged toward the nearest wall, his sword raised high. He brought it down with all his strength, the blade biting into the shimmering surface. The wall cracked, and a surge of energy erupted from the breach, sending Jinwoo flying backward. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, but he didn't have time to recover. The creatures were closing in, and Jinwoo was advancing, his eyes blazing with fury. Jinwoo scrambled to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and swung his sword in a wide arc, forcing the creatures back. He could feel the dungeon's power waning, the air growing thinner, and he knew he had to act fast. With a desperate cry, he lunged toward the wall again, driving his sword into the crack with all his remaining strength. The wall shattered, and a blinding light filled the chamber. Jinwoo shielded his eyes as the light engulfed everything, and when it faded, the chamber was gone. He stood in a vast, empty void, the only sound the faint echo of his own breathing. Jinwoo was gone, but so was the dungeon. Jinwoo had done it, he had broken free. But at what cost? His brother, the person he had once looked up to, was now his enemy, lost to the darkness of the dungeon. And Jinwoo was alone, adrift in a world that no longer made sense. As he stood there, the weight of his victory pressing down on him, Jinwoo knew that his journey was far from over. The battle with Jinwoo had changed everything, and he would need to rethink his strategy if he was to survive what came next. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of respite, his body and mind exhausted from the ordeal. The void stretched endlessly before him, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. And as Jinwoo took his first step forward, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the same determination that had brought him this far. The dungeon was gone, but the fight was far from over. Jinwoo stood at the edge of the cavern, his breath shallow, his body aching from the relentless battles that had brought him this far. The dungeon was a labyrinth of frozen time, where every step felt like an eternity, and every enemy seemed to grow stronger the deeper he ventured. The air was thick with the scent of iron and decay, and the faint hum of the dungeon's core pulsed like a heartbeat in the distance. He had survived the initial onslaught, but the stakes had just been raised. The dungeon's final guardian, a colossal beast known as the Chrono Behemoth, had awakened. Its roar shook the very fabric of the dungeon, and Jinwoo knew that time was no longer on his side. The beast's presence distorted the flow of time, creating pockets of accelerated decay and stagnation. If he didn't act soon, the dungeon would collapse, trapping him forever. The first sign of the Chrono Behemoth's approach was the ground trembling beneath his feet. Jinwoo tightened his grip on his dagger, its blade glowing faintly with the residual energy of the dungeon's magic. He had spent the last few days training relentlessly, pushing his limits to adapt to the dungeon's time-altering effects. His movements had become sharper, his reflexes faster, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The Chrono Behemoth was a force of nature, its scales shimmering with an otherworldly light that seemed to absorb the very essence of time. Jinwoo had seen what it could do, entire sections of the dungeon reduced to dust in seconds, its enemies aged to ash or frozen in place, helpless against its onslaught. He needed a plan, and he needed allies. His first ally came in the form of Kale, a rogue who had been trapped in the dungeon for years. Kale's knowledge of the dungeon's layout was invaluable, and his agility made him a formidable fighter. Together, they had scouted the dungeon's lower levels, uncovering hidden passages and ancient runes that hinted at the Chrono Behemoth's weakness. The runes spoke of a temporal anchor, a relic that could stabilize the flow of time and weaken the beast. But retrieving it would require navigating a maze of traps and facing the dungeon's most dangerous guardians. Time was slipping away, and every second counted. The fight began in the heart of the dungeon's central chamber, where the Chrono Behemoth awaited. The beast's massive form loomed over them, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Jinwoo and Kale moved in unison, their movements synchronized after days of training. Jinwoo darted forward, his dagger slicing through the air as he aimed for the beast's underbelly. The Chrono Behemoth roared, its tail whipping around with blinding speed. Jinwoo barely managed to roll out of the way, the ground cracking where the tail had struck. Kale leapt onto a nearby ledge, firing a volley of arrows infused with temporal energy. The arrows struck the beast's scales, but they shattered on impact, their energy absorbed by the creature's defenses. The Chrono Behemoth retaliated with a wave of temporal distortion, the air around it warping and twisting. Jinwoo felt his movements slow, his body heavy as if weighed down by invisible chains. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to push through the distortion. He had trained for this, learning to channel his own energy to counteract the dungeon's effects. With a surge of effort, he broke free, his dagger plunging into the beast's side. The Chrono Behemoth howled in pain, its scales cracking under the force of the blow. But the victory was short-lived. The beast's wound began to heal, the flow of time reversing the damage as if it had never happened. Jinwoo and Kale regrouped, their breaths ragged. "We need the anchor," Kale said, his voice tight with urgency. "Without it, we're just buying time." Jinwoo nodded, his mind racing. The temporal anchor was hidden in a chamber deep within the dungeon, guarded by a series of traps designed to test even the most skilled adventurers. They had no choice but to split up. Kale would distract the Chrono Behemoth while Jinwoo retrieved the anchor. It was a risky plan, but it was their only chance. As Kale engaged the beast, drawing its attention with a flurry of attacks, Jinwoo sprinted toward the hidden chamber. The path was fraught with danger, the dungeon's traps activating as he ran. He dodged a hail of poisoned darts, his reflexes honed to perfection. He leapt over a pit of glowing magma, the heat searing his skin. He solved a series of intricate puzzles, his mind working at breakneck speed. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of time pressing down on him. But he couldn't afford to fail. When he finally reached the chamber, the temporal anchor lay before him, its surface shimmering with a soft, golden light. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the relic. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him, stabilizing the flow of time around him. He felt stronger, faster, as if the dungeon's effects no longer held sway over him. But the victory was bittersweet. The sound of the Chrono Behemoth's roar echoed through the dungeon, a reminder that the battle was far from over. Jinwoo raced back to the central chamber, the temporal anchor in hand. Kale was barely holding his own, his movements sluggish as the Chrono Behemoth's temporal distortion took its toll. Jinwoo activated the anchor, its energy radiating outward and disrupting the beast's control over time. The Chrono Behemoth staggered, its form flickering as if caught between moments. Jinwoo seized the opportunity, his dagger glowing with newfound power. He charged forward, his movements a blur as he struck the beast with a series of precise, devastating blows. The Chrono Behemoth roared in defiance, but its strength was fading. With one final strike, Jinwoo plunged his dagger into the beast's heart, the temporal energy of the anchor shattering its core. The chrono behemoth let out a final, deafening roar before collapsing, its form disintegrating into a cascade of shimmering particles. The dungeon trembled, the flow of time stabilizing as the beast's influence waned. Jinwoo and Kale stood amidst the ruins, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious, but the journey was far from over. The dungeon still held secrets, and the stakes would only grow higher. But for now, they had bought themselves some time, and that was enough. The air in the dungeon was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel like a struggle. Jinwoo stood at the center of the cavern, his body battered but unbroken, his eyes locked on the towering figure of the dungeon's final guardian. The creature was a monstrous amalgamation of shadow and steel, its glowing red eyes piercing through the dim light. Around Jinwoo, the remnants of his allies lay scattered, their strength spent in the earlier skirmishes. He was alone now, but he couldn't afford to falter. The dungeon's curse, time standing still, meant that every second stretched into eternity, and failure was not an option. The guardian roared, its voice shaking the very walls of the cavern, and lunged forward with a speed that defied its massive size. Jinwoo barely had time to react, diving to the side as the creature's massive claw slammed into the ground, sending shards of stone flying in all directions. He rolled to his feet, his dagger already in hand, and charged forward, aiming for the creature's exposed flank. But the guardian was faster than it looked, its tail whipping around to intercept him. Jinwoo twisted mid-air, narrowly avoiding the strike, and landed in a crouch, his mind racing. He couldn't keep playing defense, he needed to find an opening. The guardian pressed its advantage, its movements a blur of shadow and steel. Jinwoo dodged and weaved, his body moving on instinct, but he could feel the strain building in his muscles. Every strike he avoided was a victory, but it wasn't enough. He needed to turn the tide. As the creature reared back for another attack, Jinwoo saw his chance. He activated his shadow step ability, vanishing from sight and reappearing behind the guardian in an instant. With a roar of his own, he drove his dagger into the creature's back, aiming for the weak spot he had identified earlier. The blade sank deep, and the guardian howled in pain, its body convulsing as dark energy erupted from the wound. But Jinwoo's victory was short-lived. The guardian twisted its body, throwing him off with a force that sent him crashing into the cavern wall. He gasped for air, his vision swimming, but he forced himself to his feet. The guardian was still standing, its wounds healing at an alarming rate. Jinwoo clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't outlast the creature, he needed to overpower it. And to do that, he would have to push past his limits. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Jinwoo activated his Berserker's Rage ability. His body surged with power, his muscles bulging as his speed and strength increased exponentially. He charged forward, his movements a blur, and unleashed a flurry of attacks on the guardian. Each strike landed with devastating force, but the creature refused to fall. It countered with a brutal swing of its claw, catching Jinwoo in the chest and sending him flying. He hit the ground hard, blood pooling in his mouth, but he refused to stay down. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling with effort, and glared at the guardian. "Is that all you've got?" He spat, his voice filled with defiance. The guardian roared in response, its body surging with dark energy as it prepared for its next attack. Jinwoo knew he couldn't take another hit like that, he needed to end this now. He reached deep within himself, tapping into a power he had never used before. The air around him crackled with energy as his body began to glow with a faint, golden light. This was his ultimate ability, Light's Wrath. It was a power he had been hesitant to use, knowing the toll it would take on his body, but he had no choice. The guardian charged, its massive form barreling toward him, and Jinwoo met it head-on. The clash was explosive, the force of their collision sending shockwaves through the cavern. Jinwoo's blade met the guardian's claw in a shower of sparks, the two locked in a deadly struggle. But Jinwoo's newfound power gave him the edge. With a roar, he pushed forward, his blade cutting through the guardian's defenses and striking its core. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting scream as its body began to disintegrate, its form crumbling into ash. Jinwoo stood amidst the falling embers, his body trembling with exhaustion, but a triumphant smile on his face. He had done it, he had defeated the guardian. But the dungeon wasn't done with him yet. As the guardian's remains faded away, the cavern began to shake violently, the walls cracking and crumbling. Jinwoo realized with a sinking feeling that the dungeon was collapsing. He turned and ran, his legs burning with effort as he dodged falling debris. The exit was close, he could see the faint glow of daylight in the distance. He pushed himself harder, his body screaming in protest, but he couldn't stop now. Just as he reached the exit, A massive chunk of the ceiling came crashing down behind him, sealing the dungeon forever. Jinwoo stumbled out into the open air, collapsing to his knees as he gasped for breath. The sun was shining, the world around him alive with color and sound. He had done it, he had escaped the dungeon where time stood still. But as he looked down at his hands, still trembling with exhaustion, he knew that the battle had changed him. He had pushed himself to the brink, unlocked powers he never knew he had, and emerged stronger than ever. But the cost had been high, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The dungeon had been a test, and he had passed, but what lay ahead would be even greater. Jinwoo clenched his fists, a determined look in his eyes. Whatever came next, he would be ready. The air in the dungeon was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against Jinwoo's chest like a vice. Time, as always, stood still, but the weight of the moment made every second stretch into eternity. The final battle had reached its crescendo, and the stakes had never been higher. Before him stood the dungeon lord, a towering figure of obsidian and flame, its eyes burning with a malice that seemed to pierce through Jinwoo's very soul. Around him, his allies, Yuri, the rogue with a blade as sharp as her wit, and Kale, the mage whose spells were as unpredictable as they were devastating, were battered and bloodied, their breaths ragged, their movements sluggish. They were at their limits, but so was the dungeon lord. This was the defining moment, the tipping point that would determine the outcome of their harrowing journey. Jinwoo's grip tightened on his sword, the hilt slick with sweat and blood. His body screamed in protest with every movement, his muscles burning from the relentless onslaught. The dungeon lord had been relentless, its attacks a whirlwind of fire and shadow that had pushed them to the brink of collapse. But Jinwoo couldn't afford to falter. Not now. Not when they were so close. He glanced at Yuri, her face pale but determined, and Kale, who was muttering an incantation under his breath, his hands trembling as he channeled the last vestiges of his mana. They were all counting on him. He couldn't let them down. The dungeon lord roared, a sound that reverberated through the dungeon like a thunderclap, and lunged forward, its massive claws slashing through the air. Jinwoo barely managed to dodge, the claws grazing his shoulder and sending a searing pain through his body. He gritted his teeth and countered with a swift strike, his blade cutting through the creature's arm. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, but the dungeon lord barely flinched. It retaliated with a backhand that sent Jinwoo flying across the chamber. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, he lay there, dazed, his vision swimming. But then he heard Yuri's voice, sharp and urgent. "Jinwoo! Get up! We're not done yet." He forced himself to his feet, his body protesting every movement. Across the chamber, Kale unleashed a barrage of fireballs, each one exploding against the dungeon lord's chest with a deafening roar. The creature staggered but didn't fall. It turned its gaze to Kale, its eyes narrowing, and raised a hand. A bolt of dark energy shot from its palm, aimed directly at the mage. Yuri moved in a blur, her daggers flashing as she intercepted the bolt, deflecting it with a desperate parry. The force of the impact sent her sprawling, but she had saved Kale's life. Jinwoo saw his opening. While the dungeon lord was distracted, he charged forward, his sword blazing with a golden light. He poured every ounce of his strength into the strike, aiming for the creature's heart. The blade struck true, sinking deep into the dungeon lord's chest. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The creature's eyes widened in shock, and then it let out a deafening roar, a sound that was equal parts fury and agony. Its body began to disintegrate, the obsidian flesh crumbling into ash, the flames that wreathed it flickering and dying. Jinwoo stood there, panting, his sword still embedded in the creature's chest, as the dungeon lord collapsed into a heap of smoldering remains. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jinwoo dropped to his knees, his body finally giving out. Yuri and Kale stumbled over to him, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," Yuri said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We actually did it." Jinwoo nodded, too tired to speak. He looked around the chamber, at the remnants of the dungeon lord, at the scars of their battle etched into the walls and floor. They had won, but the cost had been high. They had pushed themselves to their absolute limits, and the toll was evident in their battered bodies and haunted eyes. But they had done it. They had broken the curse of the dungeon, the endless cycle of time that had trapped them for so long. As the reality of their victory began to sink in, the dungeon itself seemed to react. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight of timelessness lifting. The walls began to shimmer, the stone melting away to reveal a vast, starry sky. They were no longer in the dungeon. They were somewhere else. Somewhere beyond time and space. Jinwoo felt a strange sensation, as if the universe itself was shifting, realigning. He looked at Yuri and Kale, their faces reflecting the same awe and confusion he felt. What What's happening? Kale asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a voice echoed through the void, deep and resonant. You have done well, warriors. You have broken the chains of stagnation and freed the flow of time. The universe owes you a debt. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and as it spoke, the stars above began to swirl, forming patterns that told a story of their journey, their struggles, their triumph. Jinwoo felt a surge of emotion, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. They had not just saved themselves. They had reshaped the very fabric of reality. The stars began to fade, and the void gave way to a soft, golden light. Jinwoo felt himself being pulled, not forcefully, but gently, as if the universe itself was guiding him. He looked at Yuri and Kale, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Wherever we're going, Yuri said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, we'll face it together. Jinwoo nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Together. The light enveloped them, and for a moment, they were weightless, suspended in a sea of warmth and peace. And then, with a soft whoosh, they were standing on solid ground once more. The air was fresh, the sky a brilliant blue. They were no longer in the dungeon. They were home. But it wasn't the same home they had left. The world around them was different, changed by their actions. The people they had once known were older, their lives shaped by the passage of time that had been denied to them. Jinwoo felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of purpose. They had been given a second chance, not just for themselves, but for the world. As they stood there, taking in their new reality, Jinwoo felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Yuri, her eyes shining with determination. We've got a lot of catching up to do, she said, her voice filled with resolve. But we'll do it. Together. Jinwoo nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. And now, with the universe reshaped and the future wide open, they were ready to face whatever came next. Together.